Time for business. Kate Moody's joined us, and that's the good news. But there could be more good business news too. The US and UK announcing a détente in a long-running trade spat.
This is the Airbus-Boeing subsidy case that's been going on for over a decade. It's seen transatlantic tariffs imposed in both directions. The US has now temporarily lifted levies on certain imports from the UK. London already did that back in January post-Brexit. It opens the door to a similar easing of tensions between Washington and the European Union. Tariffs do remain in place on billions of euros worth of goods, but French President Emmanuel Macron, among others, has said he's ready to negotiate a deal. Luke Trego reports.
A 4-month suspension to trade tariffs between the United States and the United Kingdom in an effort to de-escalate a 16-year ongoing spat over unfair state subsidies to aircraft giants Airbus and Boeing.
This will allow time to focus on negotiating a balanced settlement to the disputes. It will benefit a wide range of industries on both sides of the Atlantic and allow for focused settlement negotiations to ensure that our aerospace industries can finally see a resolution and focus on COVID recovery and other shared goals.
The move from Washington came after London unilaterally dropped its own tariffs in January, diverging from the European Union's line on the matter following its departure from the bloc. Donald Trump imposed levies on 6.2 billion euros of European goods in 2019 as the EU retaliated, sparking fears of a trade war and fierce criticism from the sector's hit, particularly including Scotch whisky and other US-bound exports. Before the tariffs went into effect, the US market for Scotch had been valued at over 1.2 billion euros. By the end of 2020, it had fallen by nearly a third. While both Airbus and Boeing welcomed the development and what each referred to as a move necessary to create a level playing field, there'll need to be further progress in the months ahead, with Washington reserving the right to reimpose tariffs at any point. The EU, in the meantime, still remains at loggerheads with the US, with levies still in place on both sides.
Separately, Airbus has said it will be avoiding forced layoffs in France, Germany, and the UK. In the midst of the pandemic last year, the European aviation giant said it was planning to cut 15,000 jobs worldwide. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell says he will keep easy lending policies and record low interest rates until the American labor market and inflation recover from the pandemic. Weekly claims for unemployment benefits remained high at 745,000 last week. The central bank chief said at least 10 million people do need to get back to work. Powell said that steps towards reopening the economy could lead to a temporary jump in inflation, but he suggested that a recovery, while fragile, is underway.
There's still a lot of pain out there, and more than 500,000 people have lost their lives to the pandemic. But compared to the economic scenarios that we were contemplating a year ago, this is, it's good to be where we are, and particularly with the vaccines now. No one thought we'd have vaccines within a year, less than a year. And now vaccination is moving at a good pace. If we can keep making progress, that's what will help the economy more than anything.
Jerome Powell speaking earlier. Well, those comments do seem to have spooked U.S. investors somewhat. We saw choppy trade on Wall Street that saw stocks tumbling sharply in the last half of its trading session. They did recover somewhat in the last hour. The Dow Jones cutting in half its earlier losses, down 300 points at the close. The Nasdaq still down 2% at the close and turning negative for the year. Treasury yields jumped again, and that's what helped spark that sell-off there. A relatively muted session for the major European indices saw slight gains in Paris and Milan, losses in London and Frankfurt. New data showed a nearly 6% drop in retail spending in the Eurozone in January. Meanwhile, oil prices hit their highest levels in a year as OPEC and its allies suggested they'll keep many of their production curbs in place. The oil cartel slashed its output last year as demand for oil plunged and prices followed suit. At a meeting in Vienna, the group said Kazakhstan and non-member Russia would be allowed to pump a small amount more in the weeks and months to come. De facto leader Saudi Arabia said it would be voluntarily extending its cut of 1 million fewer barrels per day into April before weighing when to gradually phase out those limits. Representatives of Doctors Without Borders staged a protest outside the World Trade Organization today, calling on pharmaceutical companies to share their coronavirus vaccines. India and South Africa have been pushing for drug giants to waive their patent restrictions. The WTO is to host talks on that proposal next week. A few producers have joined forces with the likes of Sanofi and Merck, beginning to produce vaccines that were developed by rivals Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson, respectively. But activists say the WTO should open the way for intellectual property protections to be waived in this case, accusing the pharma industry of focusing on profits rather than saving lives.
If we had the waiver, we'd be able, in a number of countries, to scale up production right now, which would allow for the diagnostics, the medicines, and the vaccines to get where they're needed most. Right now, we're seeing just a trickle of vaccines making it to the global south, and this is just not acceptable in today's world.
Certainly a call that's gathering a little bit of momentum as the world waits and waits for more vaccines to come out.
Indeed, vaccines are needed, but it's big business, isn't it? And that's the sort of the trade-off all the time, isn't it? But I think in this case, someone has to act and say, look, public interest, make it available. Kate, thank you very much indeed. Kate Moody with all the business, as ever. Top notch. Short break for me, then it's more news after that. Stay with us.
Keep up to date on the latest from the Middle East. We bring you political, economic, and cultural events from the region in this weekly Middle Eastern program.
Middle East Matters, presented by Sanam Chantier on France 24 and France24.com.